Hello, everybody. Happy snow day. It's me, Digital Aaron. This is the first of two lectures I'm going to be recording. This one is on Courbet. So here we go. All right. So this is Gustave Courbet. He's often seen as kind of this transitional figure into modern art. Um, I am showing you a photograph of him as a young man, a self-portrait as a young man, and then a photograph of him as an established artist. Um, he's born in 1819. Uh, Photography as a technology comes into existence in 1839. So that's something to keep in mind. Photography is something that we'll talk about throughout this course. A lot of artists are trying to think about how do they reconcile with photography. Is photography a threat to painting, or can it be used as a tool? Um, so, yes, something to think about there. I think something that we see just in these images here is something that is a very modernist sort of tendency, which is a kind of self-fashioning. So, sort of a construction of one's identity as a kind of work of art and as a means of promotion. So when we say Courbet, the same way when we say Picasso or Dali or Warhol, oftentimes in our mind, we will think about the image of the artist as much as we will think about an image of the work that they create. And that in and of itself is kind of a modernist thing. Not only are you trying to find a kind of signature style or approach to art, but you're also creating a persona, a kind of brand for yourself. And this idea of self-branding or making your own brand is a kind of idea that comes out of capitalism. And so, if to some extent modernism is trying to make sense of this world being changed by capitalism, it's not surprising that you will find artists taking some of the tactics from capitalism and incorporating it into their own practice. Okay. So, Courbet is born in Ornans. This is the little province around the village of Ornans. It's quite a distance from Paris, almost as far away as you could get from Paris and still be in France. So he's closer to Switzerland than he is to Paris. And this idea of existing on the periphery or of being an outsider is a theme that we will find running through a lot of modern art and modernist artists. And part of this concept of creating your own persona or your own kind of brand, especially as a modernist, is positioning yourself as an outsider. Um, that's part of how he comes to see Paris and the art world that it embodies from a perspective outside itself. And it makes it, to some extent, easier or more natural to critique that. Um, he kind of willfully puts himself in this slightly uncomfortable position where he's an outsider trying to operate within the Paris art capital. He does move to Paris as a young man, and works with some established academic artists. He learns some things from them, but soon grows kind of tired of the restrictions that they seem to put on art. This is another kind of common biographical note that we will see in a lot of artists in this course is the engagement with the institution and with tradition, and then a either rejection of it or a rejection by the institution, right? And a sort of a breaking away. Um, but he doesn't break away completely. He still tries to engage with things like the salon that we talked about last class. So he still is trying to make a name for himself within these kind of conventional places of exhibition, but still positioning himself as an outsider, almost kind of like changing the system from within. He then sort of continues his education on his own by going to the Louvre. We talked about the Louvre as formerly um, the state collection, the state art collection that was open to the public after the French Revolution. And so it's this storehouse of European great works of art, and he's really drawn to Spanish artists. And eventually he visits Belgium and the Netherlands and sees work by the Dutch masters of the 1600s, many of whom chose for their subject the world around them. Um, the to just put it very briefly, a lot of the Netherlands and Belgium was at one point swampland. And so a lot of the cities that you see there today were literally kind of created by people. And so they literally were transforming the world around them. And that created a lot of local pride. And so they chose the world around them as a subject matter. Paris too will be transformed during Courbet's life. And so he sees a precedent for breaking away from traditional subject matter of like mythology and scenes from the Bible and great, stories from history, and instead sees he sees the relevance and importance of painting the world around him, painting what he sees. Yeah. Ornan, the place where he's from, is a fairly small village. It still retains a lot of that kind of charming small town character today. I'm just showing you a contemporary photograph of it, but I wanted to point out these distinctive rock formations in the background. This is something that he grew up seeing, that he identifies with. And these particular types of rock outcroppings will feature in several of his works of art as a kind of specific, legible way of denoting that he is from outside of Paris. Okay. He produces a group of self-portraits when he is a young man. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. We have self-portrait with a black dog, self-portrait as the desperate man with a leather belt, man with a pipe. I hope you can see that there's a specific kind of tone to these self-portraits. They have a real sense of self-confidence, maybe even kind of a youthful ego about them. Um, he seems very interested not only in his own appearance, but how he can register these kind of changes in emotion and tone. So he's using himself as his own model, but he's also focusing on himself because of this kind of self-fashioning that we were talking about, right? So in this first image here, you have him kind of like the young sort of gentleman from the village. So sort of a upper middle class man who is staking out and leaving his home and exploring. Um, you have him positioning himself as someone who feels things quite deeply and dramatically, which is coming out of an earlier form of art called the Romantic period. Um, this kind of high emotionality. Um, but what strikes me about these is something hopefully that you can resonate with too, which is a kind of self-fashioning that a lot of people do when they're young. Um, and I think we especially see this on social media, where we try to portray ourselves as if we don't know that we're being photographed, but at the same time, it's very obvious how kind of contrived and constructed these images are that we create of ourselves. We want to be perceived of in a certain way. And so we kind of embody certain tropes or position ourselves in certain ways where we will look interesting or intelligent or fashionable or well-traveled. I mean, again, I hope there's something, even though these paintings are, almost 200 years old, that there's something that you can relate to. Um, and he's about, your age when he's making these too, right? So I especially see the man with the pipe and the desperate man as theatrical almost to the point that there's something a little bit silly or naive about them, but there's something also kind of charming about this youthful impulse to create a persona. Um, he is an outsider, but he's also interested in becoming a well-known painter. And so it's very much a kind of almost a Hollywood story of the young boy from the small town going to the big city and trying to make a name for himself. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's something I think that's sort of charming about these. Okay. Last time we talked about academic art and the salon and how the salon visualizes a kind of hierarchy of painting genres, both in terms of the size of the images and where they're placed on the salon wall. So we looked at, going from smallest and somewhat least important to largest and most important still lifes, then landscapes, then portraits, then history paintings. And so you also see a young artist who is practicing his craft. There's a lot of, um, he's practicing different types of modeling. You could look at the objects in these self-portraits as a kind of playing with still life, right? He's playing with landscape, so he's going through and working on these kind of academic genres, even while he is kind of fashioning a image of himself. But he knows that in order to really make a name for himself, he needs to produce a history painting. Um, if you're familiar with kind of like old ideas of like coming out in society. So, like in an earlier time, if you were an upper class person, you would have this sort of like debutante ball where you marked a kind of transition from being a child into a young adult. And so these sort of coming out things are these big kind of celebrations where you are trying to make a name for yourself and trying to enter into society as a kind of individual. And so I think that is a nice metaphor for what he is trying to do with this first large scale history painting. He's really trying to tell Paris and the art world that, Gustave Courbet is here and he's a new name in art and you should pay attention to him. So he knows in order to do that, he needs to create a history painting. And we've talked about some of the elements of what was expected from history painting. And in the same way that he's kind of constructing an image of himself in these self-portraits, he makes very calculated choices in terms of this sort of debut painting. So this is the painting. It's called After Dinner at Ornan. It's relatively large in scale. They're not quite life-size figures, but they're near life-size, so it's a very large scale painting. Um, and it has several elements that we would expect from history painting. So it has still life, right? Like there's this kind of humble still life on the table. There's other little objects on the floor. You have multiple figures in one composition. Those figures are arranged in a way that kind of guides your eye through the composition. The figures relate to one another, and in their relation to one another, there's a kind of storytelling that's happening here, right? So, in terms of scale, in terms of including legible types of genres, and in terms of the interaction between large scale human figures, he's doing all the kind of things that one would expect from history painting. But like I said, he's making very calculated choices. So he's giving you enough of what you expect, and then he's doing several major things that seem to break away with tradition. Um, the first thing that you should notice is the subject matter, or in some ways, the kind of lack of subject matter. So just look at this painting for a moment and think about what's happening here, or maybe what's not happening here. You have four adult men in a dark, kind of ill-defined space. One man is smoking a pipe. He's actually lighting the pipe with the ember from the end of a stick that he's probably taken out of the fireplace. There's a man playing the violin, and then there's two men just kind of sitting. One is more actively engaged with the music that's being played. The other one is sort of looking at nothing, but you can assume that he's also listening to the music. Um, but that's really all that's going on. Uh, one of the major sort of breaks with history painting is that there's a lack of action, and especially like a lack of dramatic action. This is kind of a quiet, simple moment. Um, it's not some sort of theatrical moment when something big is about to happen. Um, it's a kind of moment between moments. Um, and if you're puzzled about the kind of lack of subject matter uh, in the image, you look to the title and it confirms that. So the title is After Dinner at Ornan. So it's not even, the height of action of eating, it's actually sort of about digesting. It's about what you do after you eat, but before you go to bed. If you look at the visible men's faces, they're obviously real people, or at least there's enough that is unique about these faces that you assume that they were based on real people, right? So they're not the kind of like generalized faces that we saw like in that nude painting where there's the river nymphs and the fawn, right? Where those women's faces almost looked kind of copied and pasted on one another's bodies. Here they seem like real individual people, but they are not recognizable to us. They're not famous people. And yeah, also the context, right? So you have the visual context of this image, which is sort of mainly sort of dark and obscured. You know, it may be a tavern, it may be a private home, but there's very little kind of architectural detail to give you context. And then the title says after dinner at Ornan. So it's placing it outside of the capital. You know, maybe it would be more interesting for people in Paris to see Parisians eating, but no, this is people from Ornan, which, you know, like we said earlier, is this kind of cultural backwater that is at the very periphery of France. And yet it is a painting that's meant to be displayed in Paris in front of the kind of cultural and political elite. Um, so yeah, it's kind of an odd scene. It doesn't have the drama. Um, Also, when we think about the term history painting, it complicates that idea too, right? So it's obviously not Greek mythology. It's not a scene from the Bible. Um, it's not a major historical moment, but there's enough in the painting that makes it seem like it was something that actually happened. And oops, Courbet himself talks about the inspiration for this scene, which was just a kind of humble meeting of friends in his hometown. Um, and so it's a history painting in the sense that it's an event that happened, but I don't think anyone would describe it as a historically important moment. But that in and of itself might be interesting. Um, it's a collection of people meeting and having a meal together and then spending some quiet time together after the meal is over. And so it's something that did happen, and it's also kind of standing in for something that happens a lot all over France and all over the world every day, right? So it has a kind of specificity and it also has a kind of generality. Um, and maybe it's making the argument that because scenes like this happen so frequently, maybe they are interesting. Um, there's also sort of a strange, like, in-betweenness about this, which I kind of mentioned before, but it's sort of an image of digesting. You know, it's not an image of actively eating, actively working. It's not the total inactivity of sleeping, which will come soon, but it's this kind of in-between moment um, of just kind of a quiet, simple moment with friends. And there's something, I don't know, I find something kind of sweet and endearing about this. There's almost a kind of intoxication that happens not just through, you know, the beer or wine that they're drinking, but through the digestion of food. And it really feels like it's the first time they're relaxing all day, right? So there's a kind of lethargy to this image, which doesn't just account for digesting food, but it's also it's the kind of lethargy that comes from working all day and then eating a dinner and sitting down for the first time. So there's a kind of mood set by this painting that involves manual labor, even though it's not visible in the painting. Um, and then there's the social status of the people in this painting. They are not wealthy. They're not even really kind of like middle class, and they're also not extremely poor. Like there's a kind of humbleness, but not destitution, which creates a kind of interesting vibe as well. There had been, many paintings before of showing kind of like how the other class lives, right? If you think about art as being positioned historically for the 1%, um, oftentimes we think about art as kind of, I don't know, flattering the 1%, but there was also a kind of genre of images of regular people or supposedly regular people made for wealthy, powerful people. So here I've got an earlier kind of painting of the peasant dance, and Peter Bruegel, made a good career making images of peasants. It's a very odd image. Again, there's no visible labor here. You're looking at the kind of festivities happening in a peasant community. Um, but you have to think about, why is this subject matter being shown? How is it being shown? And who's it being shown for? Right? So you've got an image of kind of everyday folk made for someone quite wealthy. And so there's a feeling of looking down at these people and being sort of amused by them. There's a kind of ugliness to them, there's a kind of crudeness to them, and that's meant to be entertaining. There's also the feeling of a kind of naturalness, right? That they are of a lower class, but it sort of seems right and appropriate, and they kind of seem okay with that lifestyle, right? So art isn't just about showing wealthy, powerful people being wealthy and powerful and saying that that's correct, but it's also can be showing the people that support that wealth and arguing that they too feel that this is the kind of correct and natural way to live, right? So it's a very kind of contrived image. Or you have other images of the sort of working class, and there's a kind of humility to them. There's a sort of passivity to them. Again, you have to think about the anxieties of those in power, when the poor vastly outnumber the wealthy, there's always the anxiety that they could revolt and there could be rebellion. But here an image shows them as kind of passive and docile and somewhat content with their very humble lives, right? This painting by Courbet doesn't really work in terms of that genre that I've just talked about. Uh, it doesn't seem to be actively poking fun at them. It doesn't seem to be meant for our viewing, right? That they're almost kind of put on display like a zoo of poor people. Um, it's almost like we are one more person like them that just happens to be in this room. And if you take Courbet's word for granted, he is like one of these men. And so he was in this room and felt that it should be something that people see, right? So he's not taking a kind of outsider perspective. He's taking an insider perspective and then showing it to the Paris art world, right? So it has a very different tone. Um, he's not necessarily trying to make this look, I don't know what the word is, overly sentimental, or he's not trying to ennoble, peasant life into something more than it is. There's a kind of facticity about it, like he's just kind of showing what he sees, or at least that is the sort of way that we are meant to interpret it. Um, Courbet is known for the movement of art called realism. Um, and that's something that you have to take with a grain of salt, but think about what that may mean, right? So realism claims to just sort of portray what the artist sees. And so if he's from Ornan and he's from a kind of, social class that's between working and middle class, these are the things that he would see. And so he just documents them. Um, Obviously, or hopefully, you should realize that realism is a subjective term, and he is very much choosing to show you specific things. He's very aware of how different his audience is from what he is portraying, and to some extent, he's using that difference tactically, right? Um, And so this is one of these ways of trying to show that he's an outsider, but he's also trying to engage with tradition. He's specifically citing this scene in his hometown, but he's making it for the Paris Salon. Excuse me. Um, so yeah, it's very strategic, and he's giving you a lot of what you expect, and then just enough of what you don't expect, but he's doing it in a very calculated way that is not so strange that it's alien or offensive, right? This is a very sort of neutral scene. And even if we are, I don't know, upper middle class, we could think of an analogous sort of event that we've experienced frequently, sort of sitting and relaxing after a meal, listening to music, enjoying a glass of wine, not quite ready for bed, but not really actively doing anything physical, right? And so it's a sort of a pleasant scene. Um, Also, it seemed to engage with a kind of art history, like I said before, of like the Dutch masters. So these sort of humble interior scenes were something that you would see somebody like Rembrandt doing. And so, yeah, it was a very smart kind of choice that he made in this painting. And it was appreciated. It won a medal. It was purchased by the government. It was immediately put in a museum where it still exists today in France. And so, you know, it was a very successful first outing or a kind of coming out or debutante kind of painting for Courbet. Um, Sorry. I mentioned that for the salon, you had to submit your painting and it would be judged by a jury and either accepted or rejected for exhibition. So, the painting was accepted and then it was given a prize. And so not only was his painting purchased, but he was there was also another kind of privilege that came with this prize, which was that he would not have to submit his work to a jury, that from now on it would be automatically accepted. Um, this is a very kind of important thing. If you think about constructing a persona or constructing a kind of career for yourself, you have to be strategic and you kind of have to play the long game. So he's making, somewhat kind of safe choices with this first painting. And by attracting the attention and praise of the community, he knows that on his next outing, because he doesn't have to send it by the jury, he can do something even more provocative or break even more with the kind of conventions of the academy and the salon. And that's exactly what he does. Um, and there's a nice kind of through line between this painting and the next major painting that he exhibits. If you look at the kind of humbleness of this scene, the sort of working class, this sort of idea that it's not beautiful and perfect, but it's kind of rustic, maybe even a little dusty or dirty. There's a kind of lethargy that maybe comes from work, but the work isn't visible. All of those things he kind of turns up to the next level. And this is the quote that sort of contextualizes this painting. So, if he had made a kind of respectable early name for himself as a young artist with After Dinner at Ornan, this was the painting which put his name on everyone's lips. Um, this was a painting that was intentionally created to stoke controversy. And he actually kind of wanted a negative reaction, which is a very strange idea, especially within these traditional kind of circumstances, If you wanted to be a academic artist, you wanted people to like your work. And it has become a very kind of modernist trope to make work that's specifically engineered, not just that people don't like it, but that people talk about it, to create work that sparks controversy. If you've heard the idea that there's no such thing as bad publicity, that's very much what's happening here. To some extent, the kind of worst thing that you could do as a painter is make something that is so conventional that no one thinks twice about it. Whereas here, he's just as tactical in this painting as he is in this painting, but he's specifically kind of turning conventions on their head. Um, this again is taking the scale, at least, of history painting. So it's 5 by 8 feet, which means again that the figures are almost life size. Um, he is giving you elements of history painting, right? Not only the scale, but you've got like a little still life here. You've got a little still life here. You could call this a landscape. I mean, it's almost kind of like a backdrop, but uh, there's sort of bare minimum that would count as a landscape. You've got a little cliff outcropping and a little wedge of sky, right? You've got two full-size human figures that are interacting with one another, but that's about it, right? We talked about this painting as strange in the sense that not only is it not an important event, but it's not, or, important or legible or known event, but it's also not super interesting. Like there's just not that much happening. Um, and yet it had a kind of humbleness which made it okay. Um, whereas here, you have a subject matter that is very taboo, and that subject matter is work, and not just work, but manual labor, and kind of the most difficult, strenuous, low-paid kind of manual labor possible. Um, I haven't talked about this yet, but in the 1800s, France was incredibly concerned with ideas of class, which should maybe seem strange because not that long ago there was the French Revolution, and the whole idea was that we need to get rid of the aristocracy, that there needs to be more equality. And yet, even after the aristocracy had lost its kind of political foothold, France continued to be really interested and anxious about class and class divisions, and also like the legibility of class, that I should be able to look at someone and know exactly kind of where they fit on the hierarchy of social class. And so this painting is very much trying to be provocative by not only showing you labor, manual labor, but showing you a kind of class of people that the average salon goer did not want to engage with, right? If you're middle class or upper middle class or kind of quite wealthy, you mainly would stick with your, in the words of that day, your equals, right? People of a similar class to you. You would socialize with them. If you did work, you would work with people of a similar kind of socioeconomic status. And even though technically the salon was open to the public, you have to think that working class people would have felt a kind of social pressure that they didn't belong. And so they would not have gone to the salon to look at art, even if it was technically acceptable. Also, you have to think that people who are working class are mainly focused on satisfying their basic human needs. And so they're most likely not going to be going to museums. And so not only would salon goers not frequently see working class or lower working class people during their normal day, they certainly wouldn't expect them to see them as attendants at the salon, and they especially would never think about seeing a painting of them, right? Um, and maybe if they did, it might look something like this, right? Where it's obviously trying to make fun of the bottom, 50% of society. Uh, Here, it is very much forcing you to engage with labor. And it's forcing you to engage with a kind of labor that's usually made invisible to upper class people. So before we go on, I think it would be good to talk about what the title of this painting means. It's called The Stonebreakers, and it's quite obvious that that is what's happening. So there are a variety of stones of different sizes, and it seems that the job of these men are to break large stones into smaller stones. And then once the stones are small enough, they can be moved. And so you have the kind of two sides of this work happening. You have the older man breaking the stones, and you have the younger man carrying the smaller stones. This is a kind of work that was part of building roads. So before steam and gasoline powered machines, a lot of this kind of manual labor had to be done by hand, right? So again, you have this indication of somewhere that is like Ornan or somewhere similar by that kind of rock outcropping, right? So it's situated in a place which isn't immediately identifiable, but it is a rural place. And they are building a road. I know this all sounds quite, I don't know, sort of simple or maybe not that interesting to you, but it's part of these big changes that are happening within the mid 19th century. Um, that you have I mean, when we look at a map today, you look at Paris, and then there's this spider web of roads that go out in every direction, right? And they connect the capital to major cities like Dijon, and major cities then are connected to smaller cities and villages. A lot of that maybe that had existed somewhat in terms of like dirt roads or sort of natural paths, but the idea that we need to make infrastructure is very much a kind of manifestation of capitalism. That to move goods and people, we need to have better roads or canals and later railroads. And so this is just one sort of aspect of capitalism changing the world. So you have places like Ornan that are being folded into a larger kind of economic system through the creation of things like roads. And if you were an upper middle class person, you might read in your newspaper about the building of roads, and you would think, oh, this is, a sign of progress, and you would see it in a very kind of enlightened way, but you were not interested in how the roads actually got built or who built the roads. Um, that kind of labor is not something that you really wanted to think about, and you especially didn't want to think about the people who did that kind of labor. Um, in terms of building a road, this is the very first step that would happen, right? So someone would plot out where they wanted the road to be and kind of demarcate it, but there was going to be stuff in the way, right? Including boulders. And so the very first step of building a road is having these kind of itinerant workers come in and clear out the obstacles. So this is the kind of very first step of transforming sort of rural nature into an economic byway. And it's low paid work and it's incredibly hard on your body. Um, and not only that, but there's the kind of idea that it's a kind of labor that is inescapable. Um, I've used the word middle class before, and we will be talking about the middle class a lot. So the middle class is defined by what it's not. So it's not, peasants and farmers and manual laborers, and the middle class is not, the kind of segment of society that has uh, inherited status and wealth, like the aristocracy. It is a kind of self-made class, often associated with like white collar labor and banking and merchants and industrialists and things like that. It is the middle class is very much associated with capitalism and the people that are intimately involved in profiting from capitalism. Whereas this, these are workers. These are low working class people. Um, and because they're so poorly paid and they don't have education, they don't really have opportunities, there's the idea that these kinds of people are kind of trapped in a cycle of manual labor. And that's something that is also very conspicuously on display in this image. We've talked about how in history painting, the human body is used for storytelling and also for kind of moving the eye around the composition. And here, even though the subject matter is so at odds with what we expect from history painting, he's still being a very good history painter in terms of doing those things. So you have a young man on this side, and you have a kind of middle-aged or maybe past middle-aged man on this side. There's this sort of idea that this is a father and this is a son, and that the father was once like him, and he will eventually be like him. And if you think about the kind of like the life cycle of a human. You mature, you get larger, you get stronger until you reach a kind of physical peak in your, late adolescence, early adulthood, and then there's the long decline into, you know, becoming elderly, right? So there is this upward kind of motion that's happening here with the young man, where he's stepping up. He's using his muscles to kind of lift this heavy basket of stones. And that kind of upward motion goes through his body, and then it's carried through this implement as well. So there's this kind of upward thrust thing that's happening here. And then we look at the kind of physical action that the man on the right is doing. He is in mid swing taking this hammer down. So he's got this downward motion and he's also kneeling on one knee. And so there's very much this kind of arc that's happening where there's youth going up and then adulthood going into being elderly coming down. And if you want to get even more sort of cynical about it, he's rising up from the earth the same way a baby rises up into adulthood, and he is going down towards the earth, towards death, right? Towards being buried. And there's almost this kind of like hidden arc underneath where you can trace it all the way through and then it repeats itself. So in the same way that this young man will become this older man, he will produce a next generation who will follow in his labor, and this kind of cycle will keep going over and over again, right? So Courbet's confronting you with manual labor, and yet at the same time, he's doing something else really interesting, which is that he's not showing you their faces. So when we looked at this painting, we got the sense that these were unique individuals. Even if they're not portraits in the conventional sense where they're named in the title, they have enough individuality that makes them appear to be specific individuals, right? So even though we can think about this sort of like after dinner digestion as something that happens all over the world every day, there's a kind of specificity about it through these men's faces. Whereas here, it not only is forcing you to confront labor and like who does labor, but at the same time, it's not giving you the humanity of these people. It's not letting you know that they are individuals. Their faces are either totally obscured or kind of generalized. And so that does a couple things. It speaks about this being a kind of universal thing, right? That there's manual labor going on all over the place that we don't want to see. But it's also talking about how we treat people like this. We would prefer not to think about them or would prefer not to think about them as individual human beings. So, um, also, the idea that they are kind of trapped in this cycle of labor, that's furthered by this landscape or this sort of illusion of a landscape, which is very much kind of like suffocating the entire composition. There's this little kind of wedge of light, but it seems like they are trapped within this landscape. It's almost like it's a kind of landslide of material sort of suffocating them. And so, yeah, that's just one more visual way of kind of doing this storytelling that it's a kind of cyclical labor which they're trapped in and they can't get out of, right? And so, yeah, he's using that advantage that he had of not having to pass his work by the jury. And instead of like building upon his name in terms of appreciation, he's using the opportunity and the kind of venue to address a large public, to address something that people specifically don't want to think about. And in its everyday quality, it's specifically going against what the Academy would say the goal of art is, which is to ennoble and perfect the world around us and to give us these kind of moral lessons. Here, it's confronting us with reality, but it's confronting us with a difficult reality which we don't want to be confronted with. And it's intentionally upsetting the kinds of people that would see paintings at the salon, right? So he's very much intentionally creating controversy. And he was ridiculed for it. I talked about how the salons being open to the public was meant to kind of enforce academic views on art and taste, and at the same time, by allowing people who couldn't afford paintings to see so many paintings, it created this opportunity for aesthetic judgment. And so at the same time, you also have the rise of newspapers, and you have newspapers that are catered to every different segment of society, from the working class to the middle class to the upper class. And so that idea of art criticism and developing your own taste comes through in periodicals of the time. And so these are all sort of cartoons lampooning and caricaturing Courbet's painting. Um, they have, this image here is like using a sort of peasant or worker as a model in the same way that one would think about a kind of conventional artist studio. And here, the model is not beautiful and perfect, but it's this kind of everyday working man. And instead of having like plaster casts and other sort of artistic objects of inspiration on the wall, you have like a workman's glove. Here, they're taking the composition of the painting and making it even more chaotic and intentionally kind of ugly. And then there's this image here where where the joke is that this kind of painting is so popular that now everybody is painting workers, which was the exact opposite of what was happening. People really didn't like this painting. It was not fashionable, but the joke here is that now everyone is painting workers, right? Um, Something that we're going to see frequently is that when the public engages with work like this, they don't, there's a kind of blindness to it, or there's a way of, how do I put this? Instead of engaging with the politics, they engage it aesthetically. And by that, I mean, instead of saying, oh, this is a painting which specifically, is trying to counter things that we expect, or it's trying to show us labor or whatever. Um, Instead of engaging with the politics, it will just reduce it to ugliness, right? So here, Courbet has given us a scene which is all in kind of earth tones. You've got tattered clothing. Um, it was a very sort of like unsightly image, and that's meant to be used tactically to think about how we consider labor and the people that do labor, but instead the public just focuses on ugliness. They don't want to engage with the politics. They just say, it's a bad painting because it's ugly, because it's dirty, and, it's brown, and, it's offensive because it's ugly. And that's something that we'll see frequently, especially in this early part of modernism, is that artists are very tactically doing things to engage with a kind of social or political critique, and the public is so bothered by it that they can't even seem to really address why they're so bothered by it. And so the only thing that they can say is that it's ugly. Um, Yeah. I mean, this will kind of continue throughout a lot of modernism, right? So when we get into works that are totally abstract, it's very easy for people to say, oh, my kid could do that, or that's ugly, or that doesn't look like painting, because they really don't want to engage with why people are making abstract work. And so the same thing is true for depicting labor. Okay. Also, you know, this is an art history class, so we're thinking about why art is happening at a certain time. Does art reflect things that are already happening, or is it part of this conversation that kind of propels historical events further, right? So we've got Courbet dealing specifically with labor in 1849. For anyone that is, you know, into history, this is a major kind of turning point in European history. You have the publishing of the Communist Manifesto the year before, and the Communist Manifesto and its attempt to critique and kind of overturn the political and economic system is not something that Marx and Engels should get total credit for. They are famous for kind of putting these ideas down on paper and publishing them, but these were sentiments uh, that were pervasive all over Europe, you know? People like these two men are upset with the kind of system that is in place where they are paid so little for such difficult work, and there seems to be no appreciation for that work, and they have no stake in the kind of system that they're building, right? If they're building roads, which will then, improve the economy, they have no stake in that improvement. Um, and we talked about how the people who really profit from these kind of transformations and changes don't even want to kind of acknowledge the existence of workers like this, right? So not only are they poorly paid, but they are dismissed. And so these kind of sentiments were pervasive and, were articulated very well by Marx and Engels, but yeah, there was a lot of resistance to the kind of system that was in place that's associated with capitalism. And all over Europe and even around the world, there were these major kind of popular revolutions around the mid-century, around 1848, 1850, where the working class wanted to rise up and demand for more rights and better pay and things like that. So he's very much engaging with a long-standing resistance to looking at labor, but also a very contemporary, controversial subject as well. Another major work by Courbet, um, which again, there's a nice kind of through line with some of the images that I've shown you already, where there's a subject matter which seems to break away from conventions of history painting while retaining many of the kind of visual elements of history painting. So here we have an absolutely enormous canvas, 10 by 22 feet. Um, so life-size figures, dozens of life-size figures. You have the rock outcroppings associated with Ornan. You have Ornan referenced in the title. Um, the subject matter is something that is commonplace in a sense, right? It's sort of like after dinner at Ornan in that, digesting after a meal is something we're all familiar with. Here, this is a scene of a burial, which could be done in a very dramatic way. Let's see. All right, so this is not a scene of a burial, but I'm just trying to show you a more kind of traditional history painting where you've got this moment of action, you have very legible kind of differentiation of groups of people. So there's this sort of interplay between groups of people. As your eye scans through the work, you can see groups interacting with other groups. Um, there's a drama to it, there's a kind of implied story to it, there's a legibility to it. Here he takes all of those elements and kind of turns them on their head, right? So we could imagine that a burial could be a legitimate history painting, let's say like the burial of Napoleon. And so, there's this great man who's died, and you've got all these people who love him. Um, that doesn't seem to be what's happening here. It's called a burial, not the burial, not the burial of, a specific person. It is a burial. So we don't really even know who died. Um, It's located in Ornans, so people in Paris are not only not really familiar with the location, but we don't know anyone in Ornans. And then you look at the people within the painting, and they don't seem to be acting appropriately, or at least acting appropriately within a painting. Um, there's the priest who is reading from the Bible, and there's a woman crying. There's some men and women that seem sad, right? But that's like maybe six people out of several dozen figures. If you look throughout this painting, there's a whole spectrum of different emotions, but none of them seem to conform with how we would expect to see people at a funeral depicted in a painting. Um, Most people seem kind of neutral almost, right? Um, or even sort of bored or inconvenienced that they have to be there. Um, there's a kind of inattentiveness that we see, so there's the idea of instead of celebrating someone who has passed, the real subject matter here seems to be the kind of social compulsion or the kind of an enforcement of certain social rituals, right? So if someone dies, you feel obligated to go to their funeral, even if you weren't particularly close to them, right? And so a lot of the people seem to just be here because of obligation, either social obligation or like with the pallbearers, they were probably paid to be pallbearers. And so there's a kind of financial obligation to be here. And even in the figure that seems maybe the most appropriate, which is the priest, he also is there because of social and, professional obligation in the same way that the gravedigger is, right? Um, and so you have this whole mass of people, but you not only don't have the emotional kind of pull or the emotional drama that you should expect to see from a burial, but you also don't have a kind of clarity. We assume that people are dressed in black because of mourning, but also what that does is it makes it really difficult to see where one person begins and the other one ends. And they're all composed in this kind of long, continuous line, which follows the kind of format of the overall canvas. Um, and so our eye tends to naturally scan from left to right, but it's hard to know, are there particular groupings of people? Why are they here? What are they walking away? Are they coming in? Right? Like it's very difficult to know exactly what is happening. Um, it's very much a scene of I don't know, we talked about agnosticism and skepticism, and in some ways, it's a scene of like what it looks like to be a Catholic. in the mid 19th century. You know, everybody is sort of automatically Catholic by birth in France, but how much do they really believe in that? Um, there is the indication, you know, there's this sort of iconography of Catholicism, but it's hard to know if anybody really believes in this, you know, or if they're just sort of going through the motions. You know, there's so much talk about if you're a good person and you're Catholic, you transcend death and you go to heaven. And that is alluded to by the fact that this sculpture of Jesus rises above the landscape, above all of the people, seems to occupy this other space. And yet, at the same time, it very much seems like this is just a person being put in the ground, you know? There's a kind of finality and sort of facticity to death. Um, it doesn't seem to be an image about miraculous transformation or someone ascending to heaven. It seems very earthbound. Um, and also it seems to invite us into this pit, right? The hole dug for the grave comes to the edge of the painting and seems to kind of want to swallow us up, right? Especially if you think about the size of this painting, standing in front of it, you know, if you were standing here, you would literally be standing in the grave, right? So there's this very kind of almost sort of agnostic view of a funeral. And it's more about the kind of social conventions and the social pressures of living at this time. And again, he's doing these things tactically. He's very much trying, he's not just setting these scenes outside of Paris, but by engaging with the salon and giving these scenes that don't conform to expectations, he's very much constructing an image of him as a provincial painter. And so the newspapers kind of take this and run with it. They depict him as this sort of country bumpkin who's painting with a trowel instead of a brush. Or by focusing so much on these kind of like scenes of daily life around him, they think that it's actually just kind of like egoism, that he's just sort of obsessed with himself and the world that he's from, instead of catering to more kind of universal expectations of what we think we should see in art, right? So maybe it's all about his ego, you know. Maybe what we're really seeing in a scene like this is just him painting himself over and over and over. Um, this might be subtle to you, but if you think about, you know, the kind of what alcoholic beverage is associated with French culture, it would be wine. And so the idea that he is positioned as someone who drinks beer and he's got this kind of like body type that is made by beer, that is another way of showing that he is not really a Parisian, that maybe he's closer to German or, you know, some kind of other culture or nation that is not as associated with being, you know, the height of culture and art. Um, this is a painting where he very much is playing up this kind of outsider status. So he is depicting himself once again, right? We looked at some early self-portraits. Here we have him not as the kind of pubescent young man, but here as the kind of self-confident young man, and the young man kind of traveling on his own. So here he's showing himself kind of like walking through a rural area. There's this sort of self-sufficiency, this kind of like outsider status that he has. And even though he is, you know, critiquing a lot of things that we see in the salon, he's also very much engaging with that, right? So he's giving you a scene which very much feels like a story. The young man exploring on his own comes across these two men. It just so happens that this man here, the redheaded man, was his major patron, his major sponsor. Um, and so there is this interesting way of depicting a kind of new relationship between artist and patron. Um, like I said, Courbet is this sort of transitional figure. So if we think about the modernist artist as just making work for themselves, we're not quite there yet, right? Even artists like Courbet, who are kind of critiquing the system, are still very much dependent on patronage. And so here we have the meeting of patron and artist. And there's an interesting sort of dynamic between them. So the patron here is obviously wealthy. He's wearing white gloves. He's got this nice jacket on. He has jewelry. He's very well manicured. So he's got obvious signs of wealth. He also has this valet, which is kind of like a manservant, right? So even though they're not in an urban environment and not in some fancy place, there's all these kind of demarcations of wealth. But he seems to be, in some sense, sort of humbling himself or paying respect to Courbet, who doesn't have the wealth or social status. And yet he's showing deference because Courbet has this particular kind of sensibility. He has a particular way of seeing the world and engaging with art that is unique. You know, a patron is rarely going to ask for something they've never seen before, right? So this is a very kind of tactical image, which is in dialogue with history painting, but it's trying to kind of turn it on its head. That's very unlikely that someone who is from Paris would ask for this very particular scene. Instead, we have to assume that it's a kind of patron that's interested in the sort of weird, new, potentially controversial stuff that Courbet's doing. And there's the recognition that Courbet could only make these kinds of strange paintings if he had a particular kind of patron that encouraged that, right? Instead of dictating everything that he wants in the work of art, he recognizes the genius or uniqueness of Courbet and gives him the kind of financial freedom to explore this new type of art, right? And so, in some ways, it's traditional in the sense that it is complimenting the patron, but it's complimenting him in a very particular kind of way. The patron is meeting him. He's sort of like meeting him halfway in this new place. They're not in Paris, they're not in Ornan, they are in some sort of middle place that is ambiguous, and the patron is encouraging him to explore, to kind of forge his own path in art. So that's a very, I don't know, it's reflective of a changing relationship between patron and artist. You also have this idea of Courbet as the outsider, which is engaging with not exactly art history, but kind of like folk culture. So there is this story called The Wandering Jew. It's not a story that appears in the Bible. It's part of a kind of accumulated literature that develops, in the many years after the Bible is written into, the Middle Ages and into the modern period. So kind of a fancy word would be the Apocrypha. Apocrypha or apocryphal means a kind of popular story that didn't really happen. So the story of the Wandering Jew is that there was a Jewish person who walked by Christ as he was crucified and, you know, um, basically sort of like insulted him, right? Um, because Christ was born Jewish and to some extent, went away from his own belief system to establish this new kind of philosophy and religion. And so there's the idea of kind of an older conservative Jewish person, insulting him. But what happens is, in exchange for this insult, this Jewish man is cursed. He is cursed to not die, but also not go to heaven. So he attains eternal life, but that eternal life is spent wandering the earth alone, right? So it's this almost kind of like perversion of Christianity. So instead of, you know, going, surpassing mortality and going to heaven and leading this, eternal, wonderful existence, he is cursed to remain on the earth and friendless and alone and without a home and is continually kind of itinerant. Um, Courbet uses this literary kind of trope and kind of gloms it on himself as part of this self-fashioning. And he's basically saying that he is like the wandering Jew. Um, he is an outsider, but he's also a willful outsider. Like he critiques the system and he presents work that is controversial and that earns him a lot of dislike by the public at large. And so he is not welcome in a lot of places. And that kind of outsider status allows him a kind of position where he is able to have independence and critique the art world, right? So he's taken a story that is negative and he's kind of transforming it into a sort of self-identity, which is that he is, this willful outsider and that he kind of doubles down on his outsider status. And that's what makes him interesting and unique. Hmm. Here we have a later image, which, when I show you that satirical image of Courbet painting himself and this idea that, there's a lot of ego involved. Um, this is maybe his most sort of egotistical work of art. Um, but it's also the one that engages the most with a kind of self-fashioning or the kind of construction of a persona as a work of art in and of itself, right? So it's called The Artist Studio, a real allegory of a 7-year phase in my artistic and moral life, right? It's quite a mouthful. But if you think, okay, 1855, 7 years earlier, 1848. So he's very much tracing his development as an artist from his kind of first major exhibition at the Salon to the current moment. And it's, well, it's a complicated picture, but there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, first of all, it's called a real allegory, which is an oxymoron, right? So an allegory is something that stands for something else. Here he's saying it's a real allegory, which is kind of impossible. Um, so he's trying to kind of give you a consolidated view of his artistic development as if it was a real scene that actually happened. It's a constructed scene, but it's meant to kind of feel truthful. It's meant to feel like we are in his studio. Um, the studio is populated by all sorts of individuals who were important in establishing his reputation and supporting him and things like that. So, that person here from Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet. You have him right here in the background. This is a famous writer and art critic named Baudelaire that we'll talk about more. He's present. There's a variety of figures that were part of his artistic development and promotion. You also have an inclusion of a bunch of other strange figures. Um, who are kind of like stand-ins for the outsider. So here we have a person that's in kind of like Middle Eastern dress. We have someone who almost looks like they're Native American, right? And so this idea of him as like the wandering Jew or the willful outsider, he's including these kind of fictional characters who are not real people, but they represent this kind of outsider status. And he's including those sort of constructed people in with actual people. Um, Also, if you look at the kind of the major focus of the work is this image of him painting, which seems normal to find in a artist studio, but the more you think about it, the weirder it gets. Um, so if he is a realist, that means that he paints what he sees. He paints the world around him. But here he's painting a landscape inside of his artist studio, right? So he's really painting from his imagination. Um, and that kind of gives you a clue to take this idea of realism with sort of a grain of salt, right? That even though scenes like this are meant to feel like something that one could observe on a daily basis, they're actually highly constructed and are meant to invoke a particular kind of meaning. Um, Also, you have a conception of what an artist is, right? So we have this figure here in the back. It's hard to know if this is a life model or a sculpture, but it seems like something of that would inspire an artist. Also, you have a nude model here, but he's not painting her. And not only is he not painting an image of her, she is changed from where she should be, which is behind the canvas as a kind of source of inspiration. She's become so enamored with his skill as a painter that she's come around and is watching him paint. And then there's also a young boy who is kind of like enamored with not only him painting, but also the whole kind of like magic of painting that one could just create a scene that looks so real, out of just colored goop, right? Um, and then it almost seems like the studio itself is sort of like dematerializing. It's hard to know if this is like a faded painting on the background or wallpaper. It almost seems like the wall is dissolving and there's this kind of imagined landscape beyond. But if we assume that this is a studio in Paris, this is an impossible view to see. And so there's like several kinds of imagined landscapes here. So you've got this very self-conscious sort of mixture of realism, like, including real factual stuff, real biographical stuff, and then this kind of older idea of that the artist is great because they have this unique imagination. Um, I also want to point out this figure again because it's very self-consciously a model. And by that, I mean it is a regular woman who has been hired to take off her clothes so that she can be the source of inspiration for a painting. But you see this actual pile of clothes here. And so that differentiates her from the whole genre of the nude, right? This is a woman who's not wearing clothes, so she's naked. So it makes her like a real flesh and blood, actual human being instead of this kind of artificial constructed fantasy kind of woman that is part of the genre of the nude, right? So he's really doing a lot in this painting. Okay. Or you have an image like this, which is very much engaging not only with class and class differentiation, but also capital versus periphery. So again, we have these rock outcroppings of Ornan. Um, we have what appear to be kind of upper middle class or upper class young women. and then a peasant girl. And it seems like these wealthy women are giving charity to this peasant girl. But the more we look at this scene, the weirder it gets. Everyone seems out of place, right? Like it not only seems out of place that you have these two different social classes interacting with each other, but like why are these well-dressed ladies in the middle of rural nature? You know, if they're dressed like they're Parisian women, why are they here? Um, and then that kind of weirdness and incongruity just continues, right? So you've got this little kind of fancy dog and then these cows, and they seem totally out of place. And they seem to be interacting with each other, but totally sort of weirded out by each other's presence in the same way that these two figures are. Also, there's these weird distortions of space where, like, the dog is on this little hillock, and you assume that the cows are quite a distance away. But if you actually try to track and measure that distance, it doesn't make any sense. And so it's like the kind of painful, awkward interaction between different social classes, which is very much a kind of source of anxiety in Paris. But it gets even weirder than that, because they're young ladies of the village. So even though they are dressed like sophisticated Parisians, there's the idea that maybe they are also not what they seem. That maybe they're just kind of then maybe they're sort of like aspirational. You know, maybe they're of a lower class than they seem to be, but they're sort of like putting on airs. And so this like act of charity is a means to distinguish themselves from her. But the peasant girl herself looks kind of confused or even sort of amused by this act of charity. You know, it's not like something that she asked for, and maybe she knows who these women are, and they are maybe closer in class to her than they would like to seem, right? So there's all of this kind of intentional ambiguity and incongruity that is built into this painting. Um, and yet at the same time, he's showing you that he can paint like an academic if he wants to, right? So there's certain segments of all of his paintings that are very academically rigorous in terms of how they're painted. Um, but then there's all these intentional places of weirdness or, you know, where it almost looks like he doesn't know how to paint, but then within the same painting, he's showing you that he actually does. So that's trying to show you that all of this strangeness is intentional. Even the fact that, like, this cow is so thinly painted that you can actually see the background coming through behind it. You know, he hasn't applied enough paint to make this figure opaque so that it stands against the background. Instead, it kind of like bleeds into the background. So there's all these like intentional errors that he puts into this. This is a painting that I wanted to focus on a little bit more. You know, we've talked a lot about how he's targeting and sort of dismantling history painting, but the other major kind of target by early modernists was the idea of the nude. And so this is very much a painting that takes pretty much every expectation of an academic nude and intentionally turns it on its head. Um, you know, so it has this very conventional title, The Bathers, and maybe if we cut this painting here and cut it here, maybe if we just save this sort of central part, maybe it could function as a bathing picture. But even that doesn't really hold up. Um, you know, instead of being adjacent to water, she's actually stepping out of the water. Instead of the cloth being kind of like an artistic prop, it seems like she's in the process of becoming dressed, right? So she's got this pile of clothes here, which means that she's not a nude, she is just temporarily naked. And she's actually in a transition point between being fully naked and bathing and being fully clothed on dry land. Um, so, the presence of her clothing, the presence of this drapery kind of coming up to cover her up emphasizes that she is naked and not nude. But what's especially problematic is this other woman here who is she's mirroring her physically. So there's this hand gesture here, and then she's kind of continuing that hand gesture here, which is like incredibly awkward and posed. Um, and it's meant to look kind of clunky and awkward, right? Um, but also in the same way that this woman is at the very beginning of becoming dressed, this woman is at the very beginning of becoming naked. So she has all of her clothing on. This is like the equivalent of like an undershirt. She has a dress that she would have put over it. So she's taken off the dress, and these are kind of almost like her underwear, but she's taken off one sock. So you have one naked foot as opposed to a woman that is almost completely naked and is just beginning to cover herself. Um, but then so there's like the awkwardness of the pose, which is speaking to this kind of like contrived awkwardness of the nude in general. Um, her foot is like actually dirty, right? So in the way that like the nude doesn't seem to have body hair or imperfections or interact with the environment, very much here the woman is stepping out of water and we can see the water on her foot. We can see the trace of mud on her foot. Um, and then there's also the idea of like the male gaze and subjectivity. So usually the women are not aware of being looked at, and yet their pose seems so contrived. It's almost like they are posing with the expectation of being looked at. But then there's also the signature of the artist within the painting. It's not a signature on the painting, but it's meant to look like he is carved or painted on this rock. So there's a mark of his actual presence in this space, which goes against the whole kind of fantasy of voyeurism. So basically, every kind of component of of the nude, is being ruptured. Also, some of you talked about the actual kind of like body types of the nude. So that kind of like pear shape was very desirable, where you have large hips and buttocks, and then a small waist and small breasts. Um, Here we have kind of what the pear-shaped body actually looks like, right? So you have the rolls of flesh, you have the dimples of flesh, you have even kind of like cellulite. Um, you have full-sized calves that seem to match with the kind of heft of her midsection, right? So she very much is not just naked, but it's an actual body. Um, yeah. So quite the contrast from either these sort of like interior bathing scenes or these sort of imagined kind of exterior bathing scenes, right? These perfect bodies that are kind of removed from time, removed from the idea of sexuality, removed from the idea of even really knowing what clothing is. Yeah. You also have this lodged in a kind of contemporary visual culture. Oh, so these are more newspaper caricatures of this scene. But there was this kind of like human zoo thing that happened during colonialization. At one point, they took this woman from where she lived and brought her to Europe and toured her around Europe because of the size of her butt. Um, and she was kind of satirically called the Hottentot Venus. So Hottentot is a sort of inaccurate reference to the people that she came from, but then Venus is this idea of the goddess of love coming from ancient Greece. Here, the satirical meaning is that she is the kind of version of the goddess of love from Africa. And she was put on display as a form of kind of amusement. So there's this, yeah, I mean, obviously quite problematic in terms of gender and race. Um, there's also the idea that potentially he based this painting on a photograph. We've talked about, the role of photography and how it might be a threat to painting, but also that the genre of the nude is trying to distance itself from any sort of critique that it is pornography or that it has to deal explicitly with sex or sexual desire. And yet there's this whole kind of market for photographic pornography. And so some of it is kind of framed in sort of artistic terms where they're very much trying to look like the genre of the nude in painting, but in photographic form. So these kind of like artistic angles. And then there's also just like explicit sexual acts. Um, and all of this kind of stuff is available in Paris. And so here with the Bathers and with other paintings by Courbet, he seems to be engaging with pornography and with desire and painting real women's bodies and explicitly dealing with paintings of women's bodies as something that men want because of sexual desire, instead of trying to couch them in this sort of artificial language of art, right? So, in the same way that it was kind of, quite controversial that this woman is becoming clothed and this woman is revealing her naked foot, and so this is naked and not nude. The presence of shoes and of stockings, instead of just being completely disrobed, it very much makes this an image of nakedness, and it makes the exposed flesh even more kind of provocative in contrast. Um, he will also just do paintings that are just kind of downright silly. Um, to try to engage with how silly the genre of the nude is, right? So, we talked about how when actual women bathe, they don't just sort of lay around and pose and frolic. Here, he's sort of taking the weirdness of that and engaging with it. So it's like, what do women do when they're alone? Oh, they just, play with a parrot while they're naked, right? I mean, it's like ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense. And so by making a painting that's so ridiculous, he's trying to show you how kind of ridiculous the genre of the nude is. Or you've got to work like this, which, I mean, yeah, I don't think I really need to say much. They're obviously sleeping doesn't seem to be the main focus of this work of art. And it's funny just to call women sleepers, right? In the same way that it's odd and contrived to call a woman a bather, as if that is like her main purpose in life. Um, this is obviously not a scene about sleeping or co-sleeping, but it is very much about creating an image for male desire. Um, he also made even more explicit images. So I am showing you a paint or a photograph of a velvet curtain because this was a painting commissioned by a private client to be part of a larger collection of erotic art. And he supposedly had this painting hidden behind a velvet curtain. And then when he wanted to show it off, he would dramatically remove the curtain. So this is the painting. And it removes any kind of subtext, or I called it like intellectual infrastructure about nudity being about art. And here it is quite simply about sex and a kind of visual ownership of the female body. Um, and yet he just can't help himself, right? So in the same way that like this is very much not about sleeping, the title of this painting is meant to be quite tongue-in-cheek. So, the origin of the world, it seems to be making this kind of like allegorical statement about how we all come from women, and so, we need to respect the power of fertility, and this painting is all about, not sex, but actually the origin of life, but really it's just about looking at a woman's genitals, right? Um, Within the last couple of years, there's been some conjectures that this was part of a larger painting. Um, this image was found and later later attributed to be part of a larger work of art, which was then cut down, which the idea of cropping in such a way has a lot of implications that I feel like you know. Um, and yet, the origin of the world has become, even despite its controversy, a very famous painting. And so, contemporary artists have like this female artist, Sherry Levine. She really draws attention to the kind of objectification of women and how even when women are objectified in the name of critiquing the establishment, it's still about objectifying women, which I find quite interesting. Um, it's also become the site of performance art. So this artist exposed herself and tried to mirror the painting as a type of performance art, and was summarily arrested. You got to appreciate how her dress is meant to invoke the frame. I think that's quite something. Anyway, so that is Courbet. All right.